Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 183. And this episode, you are not ready. Because this is a console retrospective on the PlayStation 1. Joining us and looking back on perhaps one of my favorite home consoles, we have returning retrospective guest from the Gaming and Collecting Podcast. We've got Bill again. Welcome back. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys.
So anyone who knows you, Bill, online knows that you're a big collector and you are buying both games new and old constantly. Honestly, it's my favorite thing in the Discords that I'm in with you is that like basically once a week you post, hey, look what I found. And it's usually some really well-known, awesome game and then something I have absolutely never heard of. Like, what the hell is that game? And so I feel like the PlayStation had a lot of those games. I know one of Geoff's favorites on the console is something that I hadn't heard of till I met Geoff. And we'll get to that. But before we dive too deep, we should talk about some facts. The PlayStation came out in 1994, the first Sony video game console, a thing that's kind of hard to, I think, believe for younger gamers now, like, because PlayStation's been around for so long and Sony's been making games and consoles for so long. But, like, back when this console came out, I was like, wait, Sony's making video games? They're like the music people. What do they know about video games? Although they had been making appliances and technology for a long time. And so it kind of blew me away that they were making a console. Jumping into our personal histories, mine is pretty small scale, I think, compared to both of you. I got my PlayStation late because I was a Nintendo nerd, as we've talked about on the podcast. I got the N64 basically right when it came out. I didn't have a PlayStation until, like, I think right before the PS1 mini console came out, but my brother had one. My brother, after getting laid off from a job when we were both much younger, his girlfriend at the time, now wife, bought him a PlayStation and a couple of games just to, like, you know, here's a cool thing. You know, I'm sorry you got let go, that kind of thing. And he loved it. He played it a bunch. And then eventually, because my brother doesn't really play video games, got bored and stopped playing it. And so when he would go out, I would sneak into his bedroom and play his PlayStation. And my dad would always like play point guard for me and like let me know when Seth was headed home. And like I would rent wrestling games and other stuff and ended up loving the system so much that I wanted my own probably shortly after that, either that first Hanukkah or my birthday, which are both in the fall. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what the first game I got was, but Dollars to Donuts, it was probably one of the wrestling games because they were so much more advanced than the N64 ones. Though I would say mechanically, probably the N64 ones were better, but I loved like the real motion video and the music and the entrance themes and the character creators and the season modes. So I played those a ton. But I'm curious, Bill, what was your earliest PlayStation experience? Did you have the console when it first came out? No, because you're like 12 years old, so I guess not.
So actually, kind of fun. I was born 95, so it was literally the hot console at the time.
Right.
So technically my first system ever was a Game Boy Color.
Right.
But like my first console was actually the PlayStation. We had a family PlayStation, and then me and my sister, Alex, we ended up getting the little mini PS1.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of our console for the longest time. And eventually, Alex, being Alex, kind of grew out of video games. She was more interested in her DS or her Game Boy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I kind of just, like, when the PS2 came out, that became the new console that we shared. And then I kind of inherited the PS1. And I got the fun little screen that attached to the back of it. And you could just play it anywhere. So, like, early, like, elementary and, like, middle school, when I was supposed to be sleeping, I would be up way late at night playing PS1 on my bed with the screen, probably grinding in Final Fantasy VIII because that's all you do in Final Fantasy VIII most of the time.
One way or the other, you're grinding something.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Do you remember what the first game you got for the console was?
Crash Bandicoot Warped.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
For me, I mean, honestly, the way you were talking about the PS1 there, Bill, is kind of how I grew up with the NES. I was born in 86, so that was the new hotness, and it was in my brother's room, kind of to Matt's thing, sneak in and play there. The PS1 was the first console that was in my family's house that was kind of in a public-ish spot, not in either of our rooms, and, you know, kind of in the basement. It wasn't on the main TV. It was on, like, the secondhand one. My first memories of it were at a friend's house. He got it within the first few months. So we were playing like Battle Arena Toshinden, like this was the coolest thing ever. He was and still is a huge fighting game fan. So that sort of colored the first games that I saw. Like I remember seeing Jumping Flash once, but playing a ton of Battle Arena Toshinden and just going crazy over the 3D graphics and the crazy fighting game possibilities and what all the characters were doing and whatnot. So that when Christmas of 1996, I got a PlayStation, I got Battle Arena Toshinden 2 and Strike Point, which was this helicopter mission-based combat game that really isn't very good. But I played a ton of it. And I got a bunch of games pretty early on because I was in 5th grade, and that was also when the Tamagotchi was a big deal. And I really, really wanted the Gigapet that was the Jurassic World tie-in with the T-Rex. And so periodically my mother would be like, all right, cool, let's go to Toys R Us and see if it's there because they never had it. So we would go like once a month. And while we were there, she's like, okay, fine. Go look at the wall of slips you could take for the games. And like, if there's something that's an okay price, like a $5 or $10 game, that's fine. So my brother and I got a bunch of budget titles pretty early on. And this was the beginning of my time with the PlayStation until, Christmas of 1997 when I got Final Fantasy VII and Crash Bandicoot 2 and a lot of those other ones. And then everything kind of started picking up a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely remember the first game I bought was Final Fantasy VII because my friend Matt had it. It's funny, I recently on another podcast attributed my love of RPGs to my friend Matt, and after he listened to the episode, he said to me, you realize that like 7 was one of the first RPGs I played, right? Because I think I probably got 7 in like 98 or 99. And so to me, he was this knowledgeable friend of mine who had been playing 7 and told me how to play it and how to beat certain bosses. But honestly, I had played more early RPGs than he had, like Chrono Trigger and Mario RPG. So it's kind of funny how your mind like warps these memories. But like I also remember playing Resident Evil 2 with him and us both being scared shitless sitting in the dark every time Mr. X burst through the goddamn wall. By the way, the wrestling game that got me really hooked on wrestling video games was WWF SmackDown, which is like the first one to have like the realistic looking characters and the custom creator and like the career modes. But yeah, I think Final Fantasy VII was probably like the first big game I bought, and then just would play any piece of garbage they released on the PlayStation, of which there was a lot. But there were also a lot of great games too.
SmackDown, la-di-da. We played Warzone.
It's actually really funny that you guys bring up Final Fantasy VII like that. This is a story I've told on a whole bunch of different shows, but like, you notice how I mentioned earlier, I said Final Fantasy VIII was the game I was playing a lot?
Yeah.
This is probably one of my greatest, like, dumb child moments ever. I grew up in a weird, like, area where, like, even though the PlayStation was arguably the more successful console of that, well, not even arguably, it was the more successful console of that era. The area I grew up in was like this massively like more Nintendo centric area. So we were like the one weird family with a PlayStation for the longest time. I had a friend up the street who also had a PlayStation, and he had Final Fantasy VII. And that was kind of like my gateway into RPGs at the time. I always tell the story, Christmas of 99, my parents were like, what game would you like for Christmas? And attempting to be a mature 4-year-old, I decided to write out Final Fantasy VII with the fancy Roman numerals.
Oh, no.
Oh.
Except I added an extra I.
So you got Final Fantasy VIII instead.
Fortunately, there was a Final Fantasy VIII.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a game to buy for you.
Yeah, so I got 8 the day it came out, and I remember being disappointed for about a second because I was like, oh, it's still Final Fantasy.
Right.
And it looks better.
Oh, yeah. You could fight a T-Rex in the first hour. You die, but there's a T-Rex in it. And clearly that drives me.
You can get wrecked by a T-Rex in the first hour. Yeah, learning how to play Final Fantasy VIII was an endeavor, especially for a 4-year-old. And I will admit, I didn't beat that game until like 2006. But I always interpret like me getting Final Fantasy, because Final Fantasy VIII was my first RPG ever. I've always said like me playing Final Fantasy VIII first is the reason why I have such a high tolerance for like RPGs with unnecessarily complicated battle systems.
Yeah.
Just because that's kind of how I got introduced to it. And I think it's funny, like everyone has their like Final Fantasy VII story, like this is what got me into RPGs. I'm like, no, for me it was 8.
Oh, it didn't get me into RPGs, but it was very exciting.
Yeah.
But no, absolutely. And Final Fantasy VIII definitely has the Euro game, board game kind of problem of like, no, once you understand the system, it's really fun. Guys, where are you going? Come back. No, you're not supposed to draw from the enemies like that. You're supposed to, okay, fine. Kind of thing.
And then once they figured out, they're like, this story is dumb.
All the stories are dumb, but I love all of them. I love video games.
I love 8 unironically, but I will admit it is a very flawed game.
Yeah, this is fine. But it's something so interesting to see all these games talk about these games. I do want to, as a form of context for people, because we've lived in a disk drive based world for such a long time to the point where we're starting to phase them out for digital, that the fifth generation of consoles, of which the PS1, the Sega Saturn, and the Nintendo 64 were the three main players, was the first one to have CD-ROM technology as a centerpiece. Before that, there were add-ons like the Sega CD, the CD-ROM drive for the TurboGrafx, which I think was one of the earliest, and then things that would be sort of considered interlopers, your CDIs and your 3DOs. But I mean, even
I may know something about that one.
yeah, no, you're kind of
I've
ideal
already
for being.
decided that if we do a 3DO retrospective, of which I have zero experience with, we're just bringing you and Thrak back, and we're just going to let you guys host.
We're just gonna have story time, and we're just gonna be the ones just like, is it true that they really sold it for $700 in 1994? Kind of thing. And it's easy to forget that Sony was an interloper on this. Like, Matt, you mentioned beforehand, Sony's making video games, and it's rather known legend, I suppose, that the PS1 was derived from Nintendo used Sony's sound processor, the SPC 700 in the SNES, which started a good relationship between the two of them. And so there was talks to develop a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, which would be called the PlayStation. And then those fell through, and this also led to the CDI. Oops. But there was development, and it led to this, and what a weird and wild and wonderful thing that it was. And I suppose, wrapping up my own PlayStation memories, the PS1 is also responsible for me getting back into video games. I've said before on this podcast, I'm very open, like, when I was in college, I sold a very large amount of my video game collection. I had a decent collection at that point, and for a lot of reasons, I was getting evicted and needed money. I thought this was the mature thing to do, yada, yada, yada. I sold a lot of it. I had like maybe my DS still and a couple of handheld games. And then as I was wont to do at that point, moved, because I was moving like once a year. And the person moving out of the room I moved into left behind their PlayStation 1.
Huh.
Because they didn't want it anymore. They were like, whatever. And there was like 10 games in it. It got me thinking, like, you know what? If I had like one desert island console, I would totally have it be the PS1. This is great. I'm fine with this. This was around when there was a lot of play and trade stores on Long Island where I was living. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, I got a couple bucks. Let me see what $20 gets me. And I would get a bunch of whatever the discount stuff was at the time, which PS1 was decently affordable at that point, because this was 2009, I want to say. So the collecting boom hadn't quite hit. That got me back into being like, the problem isn't video games. The problem was never video games. Video games are great. And I wonder if I'd have gone back to it or whatever, if someone hadn't left behind a PS1 for me to find my way back. So another reason why this is such an important console to me. It's formative and kind of a first twice.
It's one of those consoles that really feels like a rare anomaly of existence. And the fact that we got it and that it was a very good console in a lot of ways. I feel like this is the era, and Geoff and I were talking about this off air. Maybe 200 to 300 games came out per console before this, but with CD-based games and like it becoming mainstream even more so. This was the first console that had thousands and thousands of games, barely any quality control. And you can play some of the best games of your life on this console, and also Bubsy 3D. So, it's a range.
Currently listed on Wikipedia are 4,105 PS1 titles across the regions. It's not just quality control, which is sort of the pre-crash of the 80s, kind of like, anybody can make a video game. It was also cheap to produce. It's funny to look at price listings for Sega Genesis titles, for N64 titles, where if you put in more memory, suddenly the price skyrockets. Resident Evil 2 for the N64 was something like $75 in 1998 money, which was incredibly wild. But the PS1, actually, any sort of CD-ROM-based printing, you had 650 megabytes of storage, which was astronomical at the time. And because it was an easily accessible medium, you could have budget titles. Japan had a whole series of, I think they were like 1,500 yen games or something like that. It was like basically $15, made to be about that much, and that's about it. And a lot of them are weird and wild titles, but they're ones where it's like, yeah, but I didn't pay full price for this. who cares if it's like, I don't know, Battle Mahjong or something? I don't know if there was a Battle Mahjong, but there's a lot of weird fighting games, certainly.
When I think back on the PlayStation and its library and the games that I played, I think this is also the first time I really knew the difference between genres. Like I've talked about in other places, when I played Chrono Trigger, I didn't know what the hell an RPG was. I only knew that RPG was a genre because of Super Mario RPG, and I was like, oh, what do those words mean?
Red plumber getup, obviously.
Obviously. Yeah, there you go. But like once I started playing the PlayStation, not only did I like really understand genreification of gaming, but also I played more fighting games, more first-person shooters on the PlayStation than I ever played on PC, which is a very bizarre thing to say, but was true. Like my first experience with Doom was not on the PC. It was on the PlayStation version.
Oh, nice.
And so when I think about the PlayStation versus other consoles in my history, I really look at it and go, wow, I really played everything on this console. Racing games. I love the original Need for Speed games on this console. Some of the best racing games I think ever made. And it's just funny to me because I think I'm getting back to that diversity now as a video game podcaster and owning a PlayStation and a Switch and a PC and playing all these different games. And also, I think this is where a lot of genres were birthed on console. Like, we give a lot of credit to Halo and GoldenEye on the Xbox and the N64, which is true. They did really bring first-person shooters to the consoles, but so did games like Doom and Wolfenstein on the PlayStation as well. And I think this whole era is, like, what made PC gamers look at the consoles and go, oh, some of my stuff is on there now. I could play it there. I feel like if you were a devoted PC gamer during the early Nintendo era, it's like, okay, well, those games are for kids. It's fine. I'm going to play Descent on the PC and not play anything else. But like, I feel like here it's when those kind of gaming styles started to mesh more.
Actually, this is something I hadn't thought about until you kind of mentioned that there, Matt. The fact that most of 70s, 80s, early 90s console development, video game development was focused on bringing the arcade experience home. Always that kind of thing. It's like the arcade in your home. Play those, all that kind of shit. But the PS1 definitely had that. The Sega Saturn was extremely about that. And so was the Dreamcast. But the PlayStation, in that kind of courting of the edgy gamer, I think I remember an early documentary thing talking about how the early development on this was shooting for the 19-year-old MTV gamer.
Yeah.
So the PS1 is very much bringing PC gaming to your TV. And at that point, the mid-90s, yeah, a bunch of houses had home computers, PCs, things like that, but it might have been the family computer, the one or both of your parents use for work. This is where the spreadsheets happen. This is where you write your essays for school. And so you've only got so much time on that computer. Don't use it for games. It's not a toy. So being able to, have a dedicated machine where it's like, oh yeah, that's like a Nintendo, but you're playing some PC games on it. That's a perfect coming together on things. And so there was a lot of crossover that went on there.
Also, the PlayStation is where demos really became a thing.
Extremely.
And Geoff and I have talked about demo discs at length, but like, I still don't know from memory what the back half of Pa Rapper the Rapper is like, because I played the demo more than I played the full game. I have played the full game, but I played the demo over and over and over again. I could probably do the Karate Master song from memory. Don't worry, I won't. But I probably could because of the demo discs that I got. I love Brave Fencer Musashi. I think it's a really unique game. It's a bummer we don't have anything really like it. The sequel didn't really take off. But I didn't buy Brave Fencer Musashi for Brave Fencer Musashi. I bought it for the demo disc. It came with Final Fantasy VIII, right? The demo for Final Fantasy VIII. And I was already pretty Final Fantasy pilled from 7. So I was like, well, I'll buy that game, but I really just want the demo disc. I'll play the other game. And I ended up loving the other game. And I can't think of a generation after or before that I did those kinds of things. I feel like that's, for me at least, wholly unique to the PlayStation.
Yeah, the PlayStation 2 did it a little bit, but the only one I can think of that was like, I bought this game for the demo was Zone of the Enders for the Metal Gear Solid 2 demo disc. PS1, there again, if you wanted to get advertising out for a game or a little taste of something, putting that on a cartridge is ridiculous. There's not a Donkey Kong Country demo, but there is a VHS tape that is a whole bunch of advertising for this upcoming Donkey Kong Country game. Whereas the PlayStation had more than 10 interactive sampler discs throughout its life that when you got your new PlayStation console, They didn't have pack-in titles. You didn't get it with Tetris. You didn't get it with Crash Bandicoot or Metal Gear Solid or anything like that. You would get a disc that was 12 or more demos and videos of current-ish PlayStation titles so that you could try them out. And yeah, there's plenty of games from there. Like, yeah, all of us did Chop Chop Master Onion Stage. Kick Punch, it will never leave your mind. This is the only way I've ever played Blast Chamber, this 3D deathmatch where you could rotate the screen. Everyone had a bomb strapped to their chest, and there was like a crystal to pick up and drop in goals. If you put it in yours, you'd get a point, and the bomb timer would stop for a little bit. If you put it in somebody else's goal, it made theirs faster, and the idea was to survive till the end of it. I've only ever played the demo. If I were to see the real thing out in the wild while collecting, I'd almost believe it was a repro cartridge. No one made a full game of that. It was just that one demo on the sampler disc. I mean, Matt, you mentioned diversifying your genre palette while playing on the PS1. I wasn't necessarily going to get NFL Game Day 98. My brother did. I wasn't going to. But if it's on the demo disc, yeah, I'll try it out. I'll play it a little bit. I'll watch the opening to Tekken 2 over and over again and then have that one fight that you're able to have in it. And so that was another way that it got the word out, got everybody out there. I mean, even more on demo discs. Did either of you play much of PlayStation Underground?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the big one for me. Like, I do collect demo discs, but PlayStation Underground was incredible. PlayStation Underground was a CD-ROM-based magazine. It came out quarterly. There were 17 of them over the course of the PlayStation into the PlayStation 2's life, but only for PS1. That were 2 discs that contained videos of upcoming games, demos of games, video interviews, basically features of things like here's 10 minutes of E3. Here's, I don't know, Frankie Muniz playing something, as well as cheat codes that you can look up, save files that you could download to your memory card that had things unlocked for games of the time. And there was also cheat codes you could put into PlayStation Underground in order to unlock additional things. And each subsequent issue would tell you some of the passwords for the previous issue. Now, I never had a subscription to this, but a friend of mine had like whatever the one copy, holiday issue or something that everybody freaking had. So that was my introduction into it. And collecting for it now is such an incredible time capsule of the culture at the time. Demo discs are so cool for historical reasons of seeing where a game was at the time, seeing what the vertical slice they would provide for you was, seeing any of that. But PlayStation Underground was one of those things, even more than the official PlayStation Magazine demo discs that were every month in the magazine, was such a, here is what gaming felt like at the time. Here is what was important. Is some of it still important? Here is what was cutting-edge graphics at the time. Anything that had cutting-edge FMVs on the PS1 has not aged well. We might like them more or less, but the FMVs in Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX have not aged great. Some better than others, but there we are. And so it's such an interesting thing to be able to see those artifacts.
I didn't have the subscription to Underground back in the day, but I had friends who had it, so I would kind of borrow the discs from them every now and then. We kind of traded because I actually would get the PlayStation Magazine discs at the same time.
Ooh, yeah, that's great.
Because I remember I'd be at the store and I'd see like the magazine on the rack, and my mom would grab it just to distract me for like 5 minutes while we were there.
Well, and it comes with a PlayStation game. Like, clearly, this is fine.
Oh, yeah. So it would be like, I would get those, and my friends I had a friend who had the Underground subscription. So we'd play the discs, and then once we'd be bored with them, let's trade. We'll do that. So I used to always get his Underground disc, and I'd give him my PlayStation Magazine disc, and he used to always complain, being like, well, these discs are lame compared to the ones I had. And I was like, sorry, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, I mean, that one PlayStation Underground that I'm thinking of was also the one that had the whole feature on the Net Eurose.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a model of the PlayStation that was $800 at the time because it was a home version of a developer console. It was a black PS1 that had some extra devices, was region-free, unlocked, could play copied discs because it was meant to be able to be used as a development console. And so nowadays still has legs as a collector's item, A, because of what it is, and B, because it is you don't need to chip your PS1. It will play whatever you put in it. So that's kind of fun. It allowed for home development of games and a forum and space to upload them, get feedback, develop them. That PlayStation Underground came with 2 games that were Net Yorose games, and I mean, if you played Funky Beans for any amount of time, yeehaw is stuck in your head forever, which is the sound that was made whenever you made a Puyo Pop style matchup, which is the point of the game. In fact, there was a Net Yorose game that got a commercial release, Devil Dice.
Yes.
I love the fact that that is relevant these days because there is a Devil Dice reference in Astrobot. There is a costume in there. There is a sequence that plays like it. When I saw that, I was already losing my mind over, oh my God, they've got Metal Gear Solid stuff in there. They've got these guys, those guys. There's Intelligent Cube. Cool. That one, I think, was one of the big, oh my gosh, remembering the past moments, I think.
That's been honestly one of my biggest collecting grails I've been trying to find for the longest time, trying to hunt down a Net Yorose.
Yeah.
They're too expensive.
Yeah.
I can't do it right now.
Yeah, I checked the eBay listings, but I've never seen one at a convention or a swap or anything like that. I don't even know what I would do if I saw it.
I saw one once. It was at a retro gaming convention. They had it as like a demo kiosk, like the guy was just kind of showing it off.
Okay, that's cool.
I got to hold the controller. Like, it has a matte finish. It is the weirdest thing, but it was so cool.
Yeah.
He had the books too, and I was just looking through the books. I'm like, this is too much information at once. And I was like, but this is so cool.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. Like, you think of RPG Maker now and go, oh, that's complicated. And all of, you can go on Skillshare, Zenva, whatever else, and learn how to develop in Unity. No. You are developing in C. You can hook up your keyboard to this, you develop it on your PC, you load it on there. You want to be a game developer? Be a game developer, kid. Like, it's very cool that they brought it home, but oh boy, like, there again, if I had gotten that when I first heard about it, I'd have done fuck all with it, so it's probably for the best.
Yeah, I don't imagine having much use for it then. Now, it would be a cool artifact, but I still don't think I would have much use for it personally.
I would try something. I don't know how far I'd get, but I would try.
That's true.
It's kind of cool just to have like a completely like no rules console where you can just do whatever you want with it.
Oh yeah. There are so many cool Japan only, Europe only titles, things that didn't come to the States. For all of the absolutely unhinged titles that came to the PS1 in North America, there's even crazier stuff. It's one thing to own a copy of LSD Dream Emulator, which I don't, but it's another thing to be able to play it and get to walk through 365 wild dreamscapes. That's a game. And it's one I want to play. I want to be able to easily play Vib Ribbon and swap in and out music CDs on that.
Yeah, it certainly beats having to plug your Goldfinger into the back of it and then tape down your sensor and then swap discs because it's the most convoluted thing ever.
Oh yeah, I remember the same friend who first showed me the PS1. He and I were very big Dance Dance Revolution playing Mallrats in our teenage years. He imported Dance Dance Revolution 3rd Mix for the PS1 because we got the just eponymous title and Konamix and Disney Mix here in the States. But in Japan, they got basically, here's the music from that arcade version. We didn't do a mod chip or anything like that, but I remember having a specific spring that you would put on the little piece that would hold down the sensor, and then it actually pushed down the button, and then jury-rigging stuff when we lost that within 15 minutes. But being able to play Follow the Sun and Butterfly Upswing Mix on the home pads at my friend's house was, oh man, we felt unstoppable.
The best part about that disc swapping method too was like not every disc would work.
No.
So like sometimes you'd put in a disc and then you'd put in the thing and it'd be like, nope, try a different one. So then you'd grab like something else and be like, nope, okay, maybe this one will work.
It was such a wild frontier.
Well, yeah, and like the disc swapping thing for me is attached to not any of that, but the Game Shark, which came out in the PlayStation era. Because before that it was Game Genie, and then they went under or like sold it or whatever. Like Game Genie as a company didn't stay around, but Game Shark took up the mantle, and they were basically at that point, it was always hacking your console, but it was really hacking your console. And I remember you would plug something in the back of the PlayStation, this little box.
Yeah.
You would have to put in the Game Shark disc first, load up the cheats, and then swap the discs to the game you were going to play. And maybe 60% of the time it worked. And it was so bizarre. And like trying to explain Game Genie or Game Shark to anyone now, because you can just literally hack things or make mods, is just like so foreign. But at the time, it was like I loved using Game Genie back in the SNES and Nintendo days. And so when there was something like that for the PlayStation, it was like, oh, I've got to try this.
Mhm.
Not only did it not always work, but even when it did work, sometimes none of the codes worked or only some of the codes worked. Like it was the most inconsistent piece of tech I ever owned. And yet
And we loved it.
I loved it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you were changing the parameters of the game outside what the game wanted. So I remember my first memories of Metal Gear Solid were at a friend's house who had a Game Shark. And also we, did the developer's room in Final Fantasy VII. We broke games. That friend is very much about breaking things and going beyond parameters. And so we hacked in with Game Shark a level 100 keycard for Solid Snake to get through whatever door, because they were level number based and the highest was 7. So 100 opened just about everything, actually everything. You would run into the things of finding how tenuous the cutscene triggers were, where when I finally got a copy for myself and played through the game, I realized that there were segments I'd never seen, because there's an early door that is a level 6 card where you don't even have a level 1 card, but it's for a later sequence in the game. And so if you have a level 100 card, you walk through that door and you enter the cutscene for the torture sequence. So most of my memories of Metal Gear Solid were that part of the game, because you just end up there and then deal with it. So yeah, Game Shark. Get in the hex code. Have a lot of fun with it. Craziness.
It's actually kind of crazy because Sony had the way that those cheat devices worked was they would plug into the parallel port on the back of the PlayStation.
Yep.
That was a redundant port that didn't do anything. Sony just left it there. And like once Sony discovered they were doing this, they immediately like removed that from all future models. So then like they could no longer get in with that back door. So then I believe Game Shark started sneaking in through the memory card slot after that.
And I would love to talk about memory cards for a second, because thinking about historical artifacts of demo discs and whatnot, as a collector, finding PS1 memory cards in the wild is like, it is always a little burst of joy for me. Because, you could save to cartridge, battery backup, all of that. That's all well and good. You can't save data onto a CD-ROM, so there had to be an external piece. And so I, like many children, did not have a memory card for a while and was wondering what the hell was up with that. And early PlayStation titles also didn't necessarily presume you would have a memory card. So this was kind of the Famicom Disk System thing where Metroid and Castlevania actually had saves that you could do in Japan, but that was password systems in America. And that's exactly what early PS1 titles did. But then most of us, with Final Fantasy VII and everything else, memory cards. Could you imagine entering in a password for Final Fantasy VII? How many characters would that require to fill in for all of the potential game states? I'm sure somebody could calculate that. It can't be me. But whether it is a 1028 character sequence to enter into things, the memory card was just 128 kilobytes of storage divided into 15 blocks. They all had their own little GIF of save file pictures so that when you popped that in, you could see what they were. And when I get a used memory card, I love seeing what people saved. You see a bit of their collection. You see a bit of their preferences. Sometimes when the files are named, you get to see pieces of that too. It was one of those ways that the system had its personality and charm, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of my favorite things that you do on the Discord, Geoff, when you get one of those memory cards. You take a photo of just what's on the blocks and like, what do you think this game is? Because they sometimes were very obvious. And then other times you were looking at like a tiny pixelated square of a minion from early game in some RPG. And you're like, I don't know what this is. And I love that. I love how obvious some of them were and just how nondescript others were.
Yeah, if you showed me the save file image for Tekken 3 and didn't tell me what it was and I didn't know what it was, I'd be like, why is it a panda?
Yeah.
But it is.
I know like Army Men 3D, the original one, like it's like this really grainy, pixelated Army Men head. But like when you look at it, it just looks like a green blob and you're like, what is that?
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. We're just like, what are you trying to show me here? I know what game it is. I recognize this now just by rote. What the hell are you trying to tell me here?
I
Yeah.
think like one of the funniest ones is Muppets Race Mania. It's just Beaker's face.
I have not seen that one.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, memory cards, it's so funny because memory cards were so key to this era and the era right after. But then from the Xbox 360 on, things were designed to have internal memory, and you could still buy external memory. And even for consoles now, like my Switch has a 512 card in it. But like all consoles are now designed to have some semblance of internal memory, whether it's enough or not remains to be seen, and then you can build on it from there. But it was like the only way you could save games for the PlayStation was with a memory card. For the Dreamcast was with a memory card. And it just feels like a lost art a little bit, again, because of the blocks and the design. Someone on the team for each of these video games had to decide, all right, what's our save block going to look like?
Or variety.
Right. You had to purposely design that. Whereas now it's like when you go into your PS5 memory, it's just usually an image of the cover art or something like that. It just feels less thought-filled than these designs were for the memory card blocks.
Yeah. Is it better? Is it worse? Who knows? I say better, but that's my opinion. And I know I'm biased. Well, although, speaking of Dreamcast and speaking of memory cards, and, well, Bill, I don't think we're going to leave Final Fantasy VIII alone here. Did you ever get to play any of the stuff on Pocket Station?
So I've never owned a Pocket Station, but I would love to get one at some point just to experience that.
Speaking for personal experience, they're very cool. The Pocket Station was an LCD screened memory card. It functioned like a memory card, 15 blocks, everything else. But if you're familiar with the VMU on the Dreamcast, same kind of idea. It had the little LCD screen, and it was meant to work with save files for a variety of games. And infamously, the only one that really still had support for it after being localized was Final Fantasy VIII. There was a lot of games that were localized to North America that previously had Pocket Station support, and then it got dummied out. I did manage to find one at a convention years ago, and when Sarah and I played through Final Fantasy VIII for her first time together, like, I'm saving this on the Pocket Station, we're playing Chocobo World.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a good game. In the same way that a Tamagotchi is not a good game. But there is something to planning and taking that and not taking that. And yeah, no, the sheer amount of wild crap it got into our save file, into our Final Fantasy VIII game. I finally got to watch the Mini-Mog summon for myself. It's adorable. If you haven't watched it before, look it up on YouTube. It's like a pop idol moment.
It's one of those things, talking about peripherals, that I feel like this was also a unique era for peripherals. Like, I think about the multi-tap a lot, right? A thing that was pretty ubiquitous, although the N64 came with one included in the console. You know, that's why we were better.
Right.
I lorded that over my friends till I got a PlayStation myself. Oh, you need to buy an extra thing for your PlayStation? My N64, you can just bring your controller. We've got the ports already. But I loved the multi-tap. I loved playing wrestling games with it, racing games with it. I feel like the games, also the peripherals had some of the best quality peripherals of all time, and then some of the worst garbage memory cards, multi-taps, and gun cons you'd ever seen. This is when like Mad Catz really was coming into focus, and like a lot of those third-party terrible mini controllers and all of that stuff. Like they really, I think, took off in like the PS2, GameCube, Xbox era, but like this was the rise of that. Like games, it was just the Wild West of like who can make accessories for these things now that they were way more accessible.
I remember having a Mad Catz PS1 controller, had like clear plastic. It had the buttons.
Was it the red one?
It wasn't the red one. Like this was absolutely like a clear, you could see the guts kind of thing. It had the slow motion button. It had like a couple of those little ones in the middle. This thing barely worked. And if you want an image of, hey, we made do back in the day, all right? Like, look, don't judge me. We're trying our best. I want you to imagine a child just trying their best, loves video games, using the Mad Catz controller to play Fantastic Four on the PS1. A truly heinous title, but it's what we had.
Yeah.
And that little sax riff was catchy.
So it's kind of funny, but I didn't have that Mad Catz controller, but I had the red one that was like, it was like a red see-through color.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Being a child, I thought that meant it was better.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah. I thought my see-through one was better. It wasn't.
My brain could not comprehend. So this thing was like the worst controller ever. Like the D-pad was not the traditional Sony one. It was like this weird, like blob that didn't work.
Mhm.
The analog stick, it had this weird like rubber grip on the back that just got sticky when you played it.
Oh my god, the
And
rubber grips.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
looking it up right now. Yeah, that is very. You know what? I think I had that same controller just in a different color. Yep, that thing is awful.
the best part was it had turbo,
Yes, that's what it was. It had turbo, not slow mo.
but for my controller, it just never turned off. So it was always turbo.
If you hit the start button to pause while turbo was on, you're entering the shadow realm of everything is pausing and unpausing. And if you
Yep.
happen to be playing, let's say, Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, where you had to load every time you paused and unpaused, get a sandwich, turn the game off. I don't know. We're screwed.
RPGs were unplayable because you just mash attack and be
Yeah.
like, oh no.
Yeah,
Yep.
it was the worst. I had this controller too. I just looked it up. I definitely had this version. The funniest thing is like in the era of multiplayer consoles, which really this was the first gen that really put multiplayer forward. You always could afford like a couple of first party controllers, and then you bought a couple of like third party controllers just to have enough in your home in case your friends didn't have controllers.
Mhm.
And someone always got stuck with the half broken Mad Cats or other third party controller that nobody wanted to use. I remember, and I think I told this in our GameCube episode, but it was Mad Cats or something like that. They used to make mini controllers for the GameCube that were
Yep.
awful.
Oh, yeah.
And I had one of those because it was like $5. And one of my friends with the biggest hands always got stuck with that controller because no one
no.
wanted to use it. And he was like, fine, I'll use it. It could basically play it with one hand. It was the worst. But like, it was different. So you thought, oh, this must be a special version because it's so different from the other versions.
Speaking of like the official controllers, I only had a few minutes before we started this, so I wanted to grab something real quick.
Mhm.
Have you guys ever seen this obscure controller?
Oh,
No.
yes, that is the dual analog pre-DualShock.
Yes.
You can tell because of the joysticks. They're concave rather than convex.
It has like 3 features that make it slightly different. It's got the concave analog sticks, which actually are really nice.
They are. I prefer
The
them.
grips are slightly longer, which is actually nice too. And it's harder to see, but there's like little tabs on the
Yes, there are.
Oh,
R2
yeah.
and
the
L2.
shoulder
Yeah,
buttons,
it's a little bit of a raised, so you could, find the front.
The only downside is it does not have rumble.
Yep.
It is a weird controller. Like I had been hunting one of these things for years, and I was at a retro convention 2 years ago, and guy was selling it for $30, and I was like, I need it.
I had one of those in my collection before I sold it. I hadn't thought about that in such a long time. You pulled that up, and activated a sleeper agent. Jesus.
The other thing too is the little analog button.
Hmm?
It has modes, unlike the other one.
Oh, that's right.
It's not like concaved in like on the DualShock. It's actually just a regular button that sticks out.
Mhm.
You can switch between analog mode, which is how the analog sticks would work, and then there's a third mode where the light turns green, and that was like flight stick mode, and it was supposed to be for like flying games.
Amazing.
Yeah. That's
It was such a weird idea for the time. I kind of wish they kept a lot of the features from it, but it's just a fun controller from that era.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've spoken about this on previous episodes, and this is a great time to briefly touch on it. Given that this was, as mentioned before, the PS1, that generation, the 5th generation of consoles, was kind of the first to really bring CD-ROM based gaming out there. It was also one of the first to really get 3D gaming out there. And so the idea of how you control in a 3D environment was a question that just kept getting asked. The N64 gave us the C buttons. I remember so many reviews of games back then being like, it's a fun game, it's this and that's like, what's a con? The cameras are ridiculous. The cameras suck kind of thing. And it can be hard to go back to sometimes. And it's easy to forget that some early games used the shoulder buttons, R1, R2, L1, L2, as camera control. The DualShock wasn't released until 1997. And the analog sticks really weren't there for that long before the DualShock happened, or it might have even been concurrent with, so that it was a more budget option. I don't quite remember. Nowadays, dual stick for movement and camera control, and that's perfect. It's great. It's lovely. Look at all this. Like, do. It's rough to go back, and you couldn't design your games around it. That same idea of early PS1 titles being password heavy with a memory card option. A lot of them had analog stick options, but I think only Ape Escape was the one that required it, and everything else
Yep.
is kind of it's a nice bonus. Why would we give camera controls to the right stick? Even if people were thinking of it at the time, I don't remember. Why would you put that in there? That's robbing so many people a crucial piece of control.
Yeah, I think design was just so different back then. And it's why going back to the PlayStation 1 games is the hardest for me. only because of that camera control. Like if it's an RPG and it's top down or isometric, it's not as bad using
Right.
the D-pads. But like, again, I've never played Ape Escape except for the 5 minutes I tried to play it emulated and went, oh no, this is bad. And it's like one of those few game series that I yearn for like a re-release. Modernizing controls for PlayStation games is some of my favorite stuff to experience. The re-release and remakes of the old Crash games, they play pretty well still on the PlayStation. But
Oh, yeah.
so much better in the re-releases, although they're harder. So it's like a give and take. Also, I remember analog controllers existing towards the end of the PlayStation's life, but the PS2 was the first one to launch with analog. And so at the end of the PS1, trying to play some of the really old games with that new controller, some games just went, nope, we didn't program anything for this. You're SOL, you can't use your analog sticks. And it was really frustrating.
Well, and it's so funny, too, the PlayStation 1 was so much where I cut my teeth as a gamer. Like, I played tons of NES games as a kid, and I played Super Nintendo games and Genesis games at friends' houses. I always gamed. But the PS1 was, like, again, for me to play. I 100%ed Crash Bandicoot 2. I went crazy on all kinds of games. Still, to go back, I have fond memories, and I have a little bit of a smiling indulgence about it. But I also recently replayed Metal Gear Solid 4 for the PS3 for Tales from the Backlog. So fun to go back to that. And there's a moment in that game that has a nostalgic Metal Gear Solid thing that looks, plays, and is like the original on the PS1.
Oh, yeah. I love that scene so much.
It's so cool. And it's more than halfway through the game. So you have now acclimated and adjusted to what Metal Gear Solid 4 is. And this is a game that, is more than a decade past that first one. And to have that moment and be like, why can't I move the camera around with the analog stick? Because that's how Metal Gear Solid was way back when. A lot of PlayStation games that went for, here is a consistent camera, here is an over-the-shoulder, here's a top-down, here's a whatever that is. Again, those aged better. The 2D games that we went like, oh, who needs 2D? This is the PlayStation. You know what? Is Pandemonium a good game? It still holds up a little better, about as well as it did at the time. Klonoa and Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Tomba. They have their flaws of the time, but they aged better because they didn't have to deal with the camera.
Yeah. I mean, the PlayStation is one of those consoles also, though we did a whole episode on this topic, like this is the first time we really dealt with load times on a console also.
Mm-hmm.
Other consoles that had some like short load times or like gaps or stutters, but this is the first time we had loading screens.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny. I own every copy of Chrono Trigger except the cheapest and worst version, which is very funny to me, which is the PlayStation version. Everyone bashes how long those load times were. But as a kid who had played the Super Nintendo version, and now I have one on the PlayStation with cutscenes and remastered music and new content, I have no memory of how bad the load times were. I believe that they were egregious, and I'm sure they are. But like my memory is so tied to just loving that game and it being a re-experience of my favorite. That's the one that came with 4, right?
Yes. 5 and 6 were one collection, 4 and Trigger were the other. Anthology and Chronicles.
I bought it just for Chrono Trigger, and I only played 4. I've talked about it on the podcast. I only played 4 for the first time recently on the Pixel Remaster. It's because when I got that version of Chrono Trigger, I didn't want 4, didn't care. I wanted this one game, no interest. So I gave half of my, I pulled off the back part of the case and gave it with my friend, gave him the 4th game, and I was like, here, you can have it. I don't want it, and never played it. I never experienced the PlayStation version, even though I spent money on that package. It's the most bonkers thing, and like I regret it so hard now. I'm glad I finally played 4. It's become one of my favorites in the franchise. Just no awareness of what I was doing. I was just like, I don't need this. I'll just keep the Chrono Trigger game.
God. My inner collector was like, oh no.
Oh yeah, no, I'll make my peace with this one day, Matt. Dear God.
Yeah. But yeah, load times are a thing that like some games had funny little mini games. Some games just had a progress bar with the word loading. Some games gave you nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had the technical marvels that were like Soul Reaver.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How they cleverly hid their load times, which at the time you didn't notice, but now you grow up and you're like, why are these hallways so long?
It was a precursor to loading hallways that we have nowadays. Sometimes the old ways don't go away. It's worth remembering that the PS1, for all of its technical marvels, had 2 megabytes of RAM and 1 megabyte of video RAM. There was all kinds of wizardry that went into hiding load times, and it showed when you'd get those long load times of a system that wasn't quite doing. Ars Technica has a whole series of mini documentaries called War Stories that are about overcoming various hardships, hurdles, whatever, in game development. And the one about Crash Bandicoot and how they made those levels load so quickly for an early PS1 title is absolutely remarkable. And that's where I learned a lot about RAM management for the PS1. It's nuts. I feel like load times was the other side of the coin of N64 superiority. N6 superiority, 40, something. Bad pun. But that idea of like, oh, well, they don't have to load.
Well, as a kid, you couldn't make this argument because no one cared about it at the time. But like nowadays, whenever people bring it up, I'm always like, yeah, but your frame rates were terrible.
Yeah, your frame rates are terrible. I remember playing Mario 64 and going, yeah, it's fun, but the textures suck. God, we were snobs.
It's hilarious because the N64 is literally like overpowered for what it is. Like the CPU is too powerful. Like it's unnecessarily overpowered. But like because of the cartridges, it's bottlenecked and it can't even use all of its power, essentially.
Yeah, this is the crap we run into. Speaking on load times, are there any games that either of you can think of as like, oh, this was the loading time monster? Growing up, a friend and I played the Discworld point-and-click games on the PS1. And super fun. Like, Eric Idle plays Rincewind. The voice acting is delightful, ridiculous, British as hell. But everything you clicked had to load up the animation and the voice and everything else. You could get into a lot of conversations about the nature of the universe and life while you waited for things to happen. And none of it was reaction-based, so I guess it was okay, but that's the one I always think of when I think of long load times, because it wasn't just loading up the one scene, it was loading up everything. It's the way that the Chrono Trigger PS1 version is egregious, because loading up every scene, you have just that little bit of extra friction. It's why I fell off of Final Fantasy VI on the PS1. I played it on the SNES, so I knew how fast it could be. When I played Final Fantasy V on the PS1, I didn't know how bad I had it, so it was great, kind of thing.
I feel like as a kid, my brain was more like, I didn't notice as much at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of games were very clever with it. Like, you didn't notice it as much.
They tried to be, and
yeah, for me, I think
succeeded.
Chrono Trigger will always be the big one based on what I'm told, not what I remember. Because also, again, I think I was so excited to have this console, and it was before the era of having a cell phone, so you weren't like staring at your phone waiting for a thing to happen. You were there. You were in the experience. I feel like Resident Evil had some decently sized load times. Nothing egregious, but like I know for certain cutscenes you would sit and wait for it to load or when you're booting up the game. And I think some of the Need for Speed games also probably had some decent load times, like until you got going, and then once you were in the races and stuff, you were fine. Nothing as egregious as like those early RPGs jump out to mind.
Yeah.
A lot of ports in particular,
Yes.
like stuff that wasn't made on PlayStation. Like, I think Tomb Raider had a bit of an issue because that game was technically made on Saturn.
Yeah.
And then brought over. Rayman in particular, too, I remember was kind of rough because that's actually a Jaguar game.
Oh, Dead or Alive was the same, yeah.
Yes,
As a
Dead or
Saturn
Alive
game.
was definitely one that
Had
was
some real bad
painful.
load times.
Yeah.
And it's funny to think of those games like, oh yeah, they were Saturn games originally, and I guess the PS1 got a pity port on that. Haha. Memories of it all.
As we pivot into some games that we love and then maybe our favorites, something that comes to mind for the PlayStation for me are the games that never existed again. There were so many unique games that I loved on the PlayStation that we've not really gotten anything like since. The one that jumps to mind first is Bushido Blade.
Oh, yeah.
Which was one of my favorite fighting games because I could be good at it by just mashing the button fast enough. Bushido Blade was a dueling samurai game, basically, where you can run around in an open 3D space. It was a 3D fighter, but everyone had bladed weapons, and it took you 1 to maybe 2 hits to die, like as if you were getting hit by someone really strong with an actual bladed weapon. And it was just such a unique take on a fighting game that I was notoriously bad at fighting games as much as I liked them, but would drive my friends crazy in this game because I'd run from them, hide, try and dodge, and then as they get close, I'd like poke at them and then like kill them. It was such a unique idea that admittedly probably to this day is not great. I haven't revisited it in a while, but at the time felt so innovative. And to this day I go, well, where's Bushido Blade 2? Why haven't we
there is
gotten-
Bushido Blade 2 on the PS1.
I know, but like the idea that this franchise doesn't really exist anymore, and it just kind of bums me out because it seemed like such a cool idea. I don't know how it would fly now in like a modern fighting game landscape, but at the time seemed absolutely revolutionary and it's always kind of stuck with me as something so specifically PlayStation.
Well, I mean, Squaresoft kind of ate with the PS1.
That's true.
They got to rule the fucking school. You had all of the Final Fantasy releases, but then you had Parasite Eve, you had Xenogears, you had Einhander, you had Bushido Blade, you had Tobal No. 1, Tobal 2, Air Guys, you had
Chocobo Racing,
Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, Saga Frontier and Saga Frontier 2. You had games that were RPGs, but you also had games that were not at all RPGs, that were either, like Chocobo Racing, a tie-in, or the Tobal games, which were fighting games that were also dungeon crawlers. And also the precursors to the Bouncer, which it's a shame that the Bouncer released as it did, because I think that concept would have been fun to play with nowadays a little further. And I think we get it a little here and there, but I've seen one or two modern games that I kind of go, I guess that's where we're at. But, something with full-on fighting game mechanics into a 3D RPG-ish beat-em-up. Like those genre mashups that happen at these weird evolutionary crossroads. NES was doing that. The PS1 was doing that. I feel like nowadays we're getting a bit of an indie explosion, or seeing the throes of it that's been going on off and on for the last 10, 15 years, that we're getting a little bit more of that genre mashup hitting the mainstream. But yeah, we get a lot of those just very strange moments, Thinking of the advertising budget for Intelligent Cube just makes me laugh. And I love that game, but imagine selling that as a AAA title nowadays. I'm sad that you can't.
When I think of like a game from that era that was a PlayStation game through and through and it was completely forgotten, did any of you play Tiny Tank?
No, I didn't.
Oh, what's Tiny Tank? Tell us, please.
So it's actually by the guy who created Echo the Dolphin, of all things.
Amazing.
Okay.
So it was from a studio called And Now Productions. They only made 2 games for the PlayStation. They made Tiny Tank and a game called Mort the Chicken. Mort the Chicken's not very good. It's a 3D platformer where you play as a chicken.
I've heard of it.
But Tiny Tank is kind of cool. It's like a 3D platformer where you play as a little orange tank with attitude. He's just kind of like a snarky asshole the entire time, and he just like reacts to everything. And you go through all these levels, and you just you get an objective, and you gotta just like take out an enemy. You can explore around and stuff. And there's a whole like in between each stage, there's like the backstory gets told through these like CGI cutscenes. The game takes place years after the cutscenes are going on, where it's like humanity's been taken over by robots and the entire planet everyone's hidden underground and they're trying to destroy the atmosphere. It's insane, but it's like such a zany, like bizarre game.
It's got the kind of weird environmentalism that Echo the Dolphin had.
Yeah, like it screams Ed Annunziata. I think he plays like half the characters in it too, voice-wise.
Incredible.
Yeah, I'm watching a video of it now. It kind of plays like the Landmaster stages in Star Fox, which is pretty neat. Man, I may have to give this one a try.
Oh, I definitely have to give this a try.
I feel like PlayStation 1 specifically versus other consoles has more games that I just associate with that console, even if they were multi-platform. Like the Tony Hawk series, which was on N64 as well. But I like, especially the first 2 Tony Hawk games, I exclusively connect to the PlayStation because that's how I played them and how I got, even though I was terrible and continue to be terrible at those games, attach my love of punk rock and pop punk to those games. I heard so many songs in those games that then became favorites. Of course, Superman by Goldfinger being like the number one of those. But like that game is just so closely associated to this console, even though it had ports in other places and has gone on to be on other consoles. I associate the Breath of Fire series also with PlayStation, even though it existed on previous Nintendo consoles. Breath of Fire 3, to me, to this day, is one of the few games that I wish had more ports and quality of life upgrades, because I've tried to go back and play it, and unfortunately, some of it doesn't hold up. But like one of my favorite stories in video games ever, and one of my favorite characters, and probably led me to my monster fucking days, was Ray the werewolf or the weretiger. Like his character and his whole arc and the reveals at the end. Like I love that game so much, and I associate it with PlayStation, even though the series got its start on Nintendo. And I think that's a lot of folks, right? Like we of course heavily associate Final Fantasy with Sony, even though it's multi-platform now, because it had that long stretch of years on the PS1 and PS2 and even the PS3 of mostly only being on those consoles and not really getting ports except to PC, and not good ports to PC either.
Oh yeah, like my love for stealth games comes from PlayStation, and it ironically not from Metal Gear.
Was it Tenchu?
No, Siphon Filter.
Oh, yeah.
Incredible. Oh, you
Yeah.
want to talk about a forgotten series that like had so many releases. Weren't there 3 of them on the PS1?
So here's the fun madness behind Siphon Filter. There was 3 on PlayStation 1,
Uh-huh.
1 on PS2, technically 3 if you count the 2 PSP games that got ported to PS2.
Oh, that's right.
But what's crazy about that, the company that made that, Sony Bend,
Mhm.
their first game was a little known title called Bubsy 3D.
Oh my God, that's so funny. I didn't realize it was the same studio.
Contains multitudes.
Would you believe me if I told you the studio that made Days Gone also made Bubsy 3D?
Oh my God, yeah, right. It's the same studio. That's
a-
wild.
That's a great that they've survived, and a lot of companies have not,
Right.
which is wacky.
This is our argument. Don't shut down game studios. These layoffs are unnecessary. Like, we just got to dial it back a little bit and let people be weird. You're
Yeah.
going to find amazing things.
It's really funny playing Siphon Filter 1, though. If you've played enough of it and you've played Bubsy 3D and you look really closely, you'll realize really fast it's the same game engine.
Oh no, that's so funny.
If only Bubsy had a taser.
Well, yeah, the best taser in video games.
Best
by far.
taser. No argument. Number 1 with a bullet.
100% range, just set people on fire from 500 feet away. It makes no sense, but I love it.
I played the Siphon Filter demo, and that was all I did. I just ran around, and again, always and forever Metal Gear trash. So just running around and being like, this is kind of urban Metal Gear Solid, and I have a taser, and it's like I'm a wizard. It was
Yeah.
great.
It's just so funny because you're like, wow, this engine is horrible for a platformer, but it's surprisingly decent for a stealth action.
There you go. That's all you got. That's all you got to know. And then, again, those were like offshoots and things like that. I mean, I mentioned Parasite Eve before, a game that I had in my collection as a kid, but I didn't play because there was a handful of games that I associated as my brother's games. And so I didn't play my older brother's games. I didn't play Treasures of the Deep. I didn't play Mass Destruction. I didn't play Parasite Eve, and there's a few others there too. But Parasite Eve was more or less an offshoot of development debris of developing Final Fantasy VII. And they then like built on it and just made something weird and unique out of it. A solo character turn-based RPG with like kind of zoning and running about, the gun customization. I want more games that do Parasite Eve style stuff. The survival horror RPG needs to happen more. I'm sure it's still happening. I'm sure there's games I played recently that are absolutely that, and I'm not remembering right now. But it's fun to look at stuff like what was on the PS1 and go, what picks that up as lineage? Like, you can look at something like Incredible Crisis and go, well, I guess it's kind of the WarioWare games. And some of it is stylistic and some of it is gameplay-wise. But I don't know. There's some truly wild things, and maybe the Horizon series is the heir to Dino Crisis. I don't know. Who's to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think also when talking about games, there are so many games that are locked in my memory of like early experiences on PlayStation or why I remember this game. I think of voice acting on the PlayStation, which is really where it got its start.
You had so much storage, so you could put so much audio on it.
Right. And we like to rip on how bad the voice acting is in Resident Evil, of course, Jill Sandwich and all that. But for me, the pinnacle of bad, good voice acting will always be one of my favorite PlayStation games, Mega Man X4 and Zero's whole storyline. What am I fighting for?
But it was
Yeah.
also recorded with the same cast and at the same time as Mega Man 8. So I feel like those two were kind of together.
Yeah.
Mega Man has the same voice actor in both games.
Yeah, which is interesting considering they're so vastly different characters. That "What Am I Fighting For" scene lives rent free in my head. It's ridiculous, but yet it's anime, it's over the top, and so it stays with me. Also, still some of the best Zero gameplay, I think, in the Mega Man franchise.
Oh, yeah.
All of the cutscenes are so terrible. Mega Man 8 also, which I happen to love quite a lot. Like, Dr. Wily is back, and I can't believe he's attacking. Like, the voice direction is so bizarre. And there were so many games like that on the PlayStation, and yet I didn't care. I still enjoyed them. And there were so many games that had great voice acting too. So it's like it contained multitudes. That was the Wild West of voice direction in video games too. And how some games were so great and some just live in my head rent free because of that style of production and directing.
On the flip side of that, you also was CD-ROMs were a big move forward in music in
Yes.
video games because you could store licensed music on Tony Hawk. Granted, it was 2 minutes of each song, so it wasn't even the complete song, but it was still there, and it was good quality. It wasn't a recreation. It wasn't anything like that. The PlayStation did allow for sound fonts and creation therein. Final Fantasy VII is done using that sort of thing because the CD-ROMs allowed for Red Book format audio, which is CD-ROM quality format, 44.1 kilohertz, all of that kind of fun stuff there. That was also on some older CD-ROM titles as well. And accessing those actually takes longer. So there's some fun back and forth there again, the cutting-edge FMVs that haven't aged well. But the Red Book audio also allowed for putting those discs into a CD player, skip the first track because that contains computer data and it's going to sound terrible if it sounds at all. And then you could listen to the soundtrack. You got the soundtrack CD with the game as well, which was something that helped me out a lot when my family would go between New Jersey and Vermont to visit family, and my cousin had a PS1. I'd bring my games to play, and I also had my Discman, so I'd listen to soundtracks for the games I loved on the discs of those games. But the more important one is, again, I mentioned rhythm games. I put a pin in that. Being able to have that long of audio and that much without it really infringing on the storage for gameplay and graphics and whatever else, you could have Parappa the Rapper. You could have Dance Dance Revolution. You could have Bust a Groove, because Bust a Move was already taken in the States. Incredible Crisis, as wacky of a game as it is, has a soundtrack completely composed by Tokyo Ska Paradise Orchestra. It allowed for celebrity voice actors and celebrity musicians and composers to come in on these things, and I think that also is part and parcel with the charm and joy that the PS1 began, codified, embodied, what have you, for a lot of us.
Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite video game soundtracks, like 7, like 8, regardless of whether you like 8 or not as a game, it is undeniable that that soundtrack was incredible and building off of what 7 did. But like, this was also the first era I remember buying games for celebrity voice acting. Like, I will never forget Phil Hartman's performance in Blasto, which is
the best part of it.
I mean, yes, a notoriously terrible game, but he was great in it, and it was the voice lines were fun and funny, and like a truly terrible game, but he was awesome in it. It's just so funny because now it's rote, it's expected, right? Either really talented voice actors who voice tons of games, or celebrities who are just thrown into games to be something different or to get buzz or whatever. And when I think of games that I love, I often think of the music, but I think the PlayStation era is the first time I'm really thinking of the intricacies of the music. And like, I can imagine and hear all the songs in a way, that I did with older games too, but I think it's only because I've revisited them more recently. And music would only get better, voice acting would only get better, but this walked so I think a lot of modern console games could run. There was this kind of stuff on PC already, but even still, it wasn't ubiquitous on PC either. I think PlayStation in this era made it more ubiquitous in video games in general.
And it allowed for not just celebrity voice actors and things like that, but completely unnecessary but absolutely necessary songs. Like, if you put an opening song with lyrics and vocals and everything onto a Super NES game, you're taking up a lot of space. But Rising Zan, the Samurai Gunman, has a full theme song called Johnny No More. Don't play the game. Listen to the song. It's the best cheese. I only know the game because of that song. I only played the game, borrowed it from a friend who bought it only because of that song, because of this kind of a thing.
A crazy one that a song that sticks with a game to me is there's a racing game called Hot Wheels Turbo Racing on the PlayStation, and I think it was on N64, but I remember the PlayStation version in particular. The opening song is Fuel by Metallica, and that has always just stuck with me forever.
That's amazing.
On Hot Wheels.
Yeah, the game is good too, so it perfectly fits. It's just, anytime you start it up, it's just, give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire. Boom, and then just explosion.
But it's Hot Wheels, so I'm imagining a Nightcore version, but that's not it. I'm sure it's the original version.
Yeah, it's the actual licensed song, which is funny because I don't think any of the other music in game is licensed. It's just that opening song.
Blew the budget on it. Why not?
I mean, I license songs. I mean, I could go forever on this too, but the reason I love Twisted Metal 2 is because Super Beast by Rob Zombie was featured in it, and it had an incredible soundtrack. This was the early era of licensed music in games, and it was so much fun. As a music nerd, as someone who grew up listening to music very intensely and with a large library of knowledge, even at that young age, being able to hear these cool songs that I loved in these games was mind-blowing, which again, now that is something that is pretty common. A lot of games have their own soundtracks, but having needle drops is not uncommon in video games, just like it's not uncommon in movies. And it was so revelatory here. I will always attach Super Beast, a song that I really love, to Twisted Metal 2 because it was one of the big things leading up to that game. We have Rob Zombie did a song for the game, even though it was on his album. They played it up like it was written for the game, which it might have been, but like I love that.
Well, N2O, Nitrous Oxide, was basically a Crystal Method album that had a Tempest clone on it.
Yeah.
And I played it so much for the music and for the gameplay.
Yeah. I think now is a good time to get into some favorites. First of all, to be clear, I know we've only talked about like 30 games, maybe. Considering the 4,000 games that are in this library, we were never going to cover them all. If there's a favorite game we didn't mention, please let us know. I could see us doing a second episode on the PlayStation just because it's so massive.
We could call it Disc 2.
We could call it Disc 2. Some of these older consoles, I think, would require it. I think when we do the first Xbox, also the Super Nintendo, some of these consoles are just so massive in scope and were so influential to video game design.
Of course.
I find it hard to not be cliche and just say Final Fantasy VII, which is one of my favorite games on the console. But I think for me, the one that really stands out, and I only mentioned it a little bit before, admittedly, I haven't replayed it in a while and I need to, but I have such strong memories of Breath of Fire 3 as like being a seminal RPG for me that it feels like not a lot of people played. And then playing 4 and going, not understanding that they're not direct sequels, not understanding the anthology of it all, because I'd only played Final Fantasy 7 and 8, really didn't have a grip on that. It was like, why is this different? Where are the good characters from the last game? Why is the story different, you know? But like I love Breath of Fire 3 so much. Some of the coolest transformations and like the graphic style, the isometric view. It had a killer onion in it that transformed into a super onion. Like Pico is the best. I love Pico or Pecco. They didn't have voice acting in that game, so don't know how to pronounce it's the Titus Titus thing. We're just gonna die on these hills forever. I still refuse Mako. It's Mako. I don't care what they say in the remake and the rebirth. It's Mako. It's not Mako. I won't do it. Anyway, but yeah, I loved Breath of Fire 3 so much. There's so many other games that I love on this console, but that one I think still sticks with me and is one I'm desperate for a remaster or a port of, because again, trying to play the emulated version of it on my Steam Deck, it works and it functions, but like without easy access to save states because you need finagling to bring up those menus on the Steam Deck, it just kind of drives me crazy that some of these games, I mean, look, we still don't have a recent way to play Chrono Trigger. Unless you have the DS game or the PlayStation game or the original Super Nintendo cartridge, you can't really. The PC ports come a long way, though, and it's serviceable. But yeah, so I think mine will have to go to Breath of Fire 3, only because I think it's an underrated RPG that I don't feel like a lot of people talk about these days, and is a series that is basically dead because there hasn't been a new Breath of Fire in a long time.
Yeah, we don't count Breath of Fire 6.
Was that like something quarter or whatever?
It was a mobile game that was horrendous, and it's not even playable anymore, so we can just pretend it didn't happen.
5 was something, like it was like something quarter. It was a PS2 Dragon Quarter, yeah, which was a PS2 game, which was also awful.
Yeah.
But what about you, Bill? Is there one PlayStation game that really comes to mind as like, this is your absolute favorite game?
So there is. It is also an obscure RPG that's getting a bit more attention as of late because a lot of wonderful people in the podcast community also love it. My favorite on the system is actually Lunar 2 Eternal Blue.
Nice. Yeah, that's a game that I played the first one recently, the PlayStation version, which I've heard is not great, and so I kind of bounced off of. But I'm excited that they're doing remasters of those two games this year, because I would like to give them another honest shot, provided they don't use the harder ROM version that makes the battles harder that the PlayStation version was. But I know a lot of folks who love, mutual friend of ours, Jala, also loves Eternal Blue.
So that game is an interesting one for me. Like, it was during like the peak of my video game collecting. I was just getting into the hobby. It was still fun at the time. It was before COVID ruined it. But I had gone to a retro store that had opened in my area, and they put all the rare games behind the shelf on the back wall because they weren't going to leave them all around.
Of course.
I look up and I just see this massive PS1 box just sitting on the shelf. And I'm like, what is that? And it just has anime characters on the cover. And I'm like, that looks interesting. How much is that, sir? And he's like, oh, it's 130. And I'm like, I don't have the money for that, but I'm going to buy it anyways. Because I was a stupid adult that was still living at home at the time, so it wasn't a big concern. So I bought it and I found out it was Lunar 2. And I knew nothing about Lunar 2 at the time, because I was just learning about RPGs at that point. So I bring it home and I open the box, and the box is full, like chock full of so many goodies that have nothing to do with the game.
Oh yeah, Working Designs went nuts on those things.
Oh, they were so much charm. And I finally get the disc out. I'm like, okay, cool, RPG. I'll try this out. Put it in, and like anime cutscene, full voice acting. Not amazing voice acting, but for the time, serviceable. It's very charming, I'd say. And I get into the game and I'm like, oh, the voice acting plays during gameplay. This is kind of cool. And it's got a very old school RPG look to it. It's just the whole game just like screams charm. I come to find out it's a Sega CD game that's been updated, so it makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
And I slowly start playing through it. I get to the scene where they discover Lucia, and basically from there the story just picks up, and I'm like, I need to know where it goes from here. It's since become like it's my third favorite game of all time. I've just kind of been obsessed with it since then. And for years, my biggest disappointment was Lunar 1 gets like all the praise. Lunar 2 tends to be forgotten. I mean, Lunar 1's been remade like 5 times. Lunar 1's been remade once.
Right.
Yeah.
And both versions of Lunar 2 are near impossible to get because they're both like $300 now. So, of course, now that we're getting a remaster, I'm like, thank you. Lunar 2 finally gets some attention. And I just love it. Like, because of that, then I also had to track down Lunar 1 and Arc the Lad to get the 3 giant Working Designs boxes. That game is just so much charm. It's really hard to recommend it to people on just like explaining it because it's kind of feels old and like there's nothing really massively impressive with it.
Yeah.
But like once you play it, you kind of just get that charm and you're like, I need to see where this goes because it's just something about it is just different from like other RPGs of that era.
The same thing for me in Breath of Fire 3. I think there's a lot that's old school in that game that doesn't work as well now, but the characters are so charming, the designs are so well done. Like, I think to me that's the PlayStation era RPG. Like the Suikoden games too, which we didn't even talk about and are some of my favorites and are also getting remastered this year, thank God.
Mhm.
Yeah, because those are expensive to track down as well.
Yeah, and like those also oozing with charm, so many characters, like it's just there's so much. Geoff, are you going to complete the trifecta of your favorite game on the PlayStation also being an RPG, or do you have something different for us?
I mean, I probably got to do some shout outs on some things. Like, yeah, I already said Metal Gear Solid. We've already been talking about Final Fantasy. I've gone on record as Symphony of the Night being probably my favorite game of all time. And so that might be one of the guys up there. After I sold my collection and those games that I went like, okay, these are the ones that I will hell or high water, cost only mildly considered. I need these again in my life. Intelligent Cube was one of them. Einhinder was one of them. It's one of these where if you ask me my favorite, it depends on like, well, what do you mean? What genre? What kind of experience? Like this is the one where I speak in the most weird, mellifluous kind of things on it. But I think, you know what? I'll slightly shift it and I will talk about an absolute favorite, Final Fantasy Tactics.
Yeah, that's a beloved one.
It's a beloved one. It's one that I have poured a lot of my time, my mind, my soul, my heart into that sudden and ineffable betrayal of a game. You know what? I never needed to watch Game of Thrones. I had Final Fantasy Tactics. As far as weird and wild story, as far as getting into intricate game systems that you could just lose yourself into. You know, you want to talk about a game where grinding could happen. I remember spending over an hour on a single battle because that's how you would get experience and job points for your characters. And I still think about doing weird runs of that game and trying different builds and taking a job class that I never like wanted to play with before and being like, can I make Oracle work? What if I had a team of all mediators? What's the deal on that? I don't know if there's a singular game for me on the PS1. It's my favorite console of all time. I've made my mentions for the sake of this list, for the sake of shining a light. I'll say Tactics.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And just running over what we like the Tekken series, my love of 3D fighters started with Virtua Fighter, but Tekken 2 to this day is probably one of my favorite fighting games of all time. I play a lot less fighting games now. It's funny too, because I don't even really play Tekken much anymore. But back then it was like the pinnacle of 3D fighting games until I discovered, Soul Calibur 2 on the GameCube, which was, I think, the superior game personally for me. But like, I feel like other consoles, it's easier for me to narrow down because there's just one standout that I'm like, oh, this is on my top 10 games of all time. But I don't think there's a single, maybe Final Fantasy VII, but like besides that, none of them really hit my top 10, but they would litter my top 11 through 20, right? Because they're solid games that I really adore, with the exception of maybe Breath of Fire 3, which I really love. But like that only speaks to the diversity of what's on this console and how impactful it was and how many games there were and the variety of games you could play. I mean, Geoff, gun to my head, I would have guessed that yours was either Metal Gear Solid or Castlevania, but
You wouldn't have been wrong.
right. But I think because of how seminal this was not only to gaming, but to us as developing gamers, especially Bill, who literally was born into playing the PlayStation, it just, I think, has an impact that's hard to define When we eventually do an episode on the N64, I'm going to have that problem because the N64 was the first console I remember waiting to buy, like waiting for the release date. And so it's going to have that kind of impact on me as well in a similar way. Consoles that define you as a person who plays video games are always going to have more impact on what your favorites are, and deciding and narrowing down those things become more impossible.
Yeah.
All of that to be said, I can definitely see us going another hour and a half, which we won't do that to Bill, who already graciously jumped in at the last moment for us, and we are super grateful for.
Yes, thank you for coming on, Bill.
Yeah, no worries.
But I can definitely see us doing a second episode. And if we did do a part 2, like, is that something you guys want? Write in and let us know. Like, do you want part 2s for these retrospectives? We will eventually cover all the consoles. We have a better shot at doing that than all the games. I'm totally open to revisiting a part 2 for some of these after we've done a part 1 on a lot of them. Bill, thank you for joining us. Thank you for giving your expertise of collecting to now 2 of our retrospectives. I'm sure there will be more. But take a moment and like plug the Gaming and Collecting Podcast Network, all the podcasts that you do, shout out all the stuff you do so folks can go check it out.
Thanks, Matt and Geoff. This was really awesome. I love coming on your guys' show. I guess if I'm going to shout out real quick, I have 3 podcasts. I'm kind of crazy like that. Gaming and Collecting, it's a show I do with my sister Alex. It's gaming, anime-based nostalgia podcast. We talk about different game shows from our childhood. Sometimes we'll talk modern stuff. It's basically just 2 siblings talking about the childhood stuff. I've got the 3DO Experience. That is a retrospective podcast I do with my friend Threk. We discuss basically the 3DO console, the games, and everything in between. Usually every week we'll pick a different 3DO game and we'll decide whether it's a must-play and okay or a stay away. And then I have a 3rd show now called Geek Addicts, which is a show I started with my friend Matt. It's a pop culture podcast. We basically just talk about anything pop culture adjacent, like gaming, anime, movies. It's basically 2 longtime friends just shooting the shit for an hour every week.
They're all really great. They're a lot of fun to listen to. You can find a lot of that stuff over and other great shows on the SuperPod Saga network as well, which Bill is a part of. Can't recommend it enough. Also, like, as someone who has less than 0 experience with the 3DO, your podcast on it is so great because you basically go into it going, all right, no one's going to know what we're talking about. So let's talk about these games and these experiences in a way that people who don't know about them can enjoy it and experience it. And it's great. And I really highly recommend it. If anyone's ever been curious about the 3DO, which I was, definitely listen to the 3DO Experience.
With 3DO, I did want to shout out, the whole idea is that we've kind of invited a few people on and they've been like, I know nothing about 3DO, so I wouldn't want to be on. And I'm like, no, that's the point. We want the people who don't know to come on so they can learn. So like, we'd like to have people on and would say, just pick a game and then we'll go from there. So I did want to say, like, if you guys ever want to come on the 3DO Experience, the door is open to anybody at all times.
We would love that. Absolutely, we'll do that. I'm just
like
a little
that.
bummed because I think you guys have already covered Balls 3D, which is the only 3DO game I know because it was ported to the Genesis, I think, which is bizarre.
Best I've got is talking Gex. Because the original Gex was a favorite of mine on the PS1.
But yes, thank you for that, Bill. Absolutely. Everyone go check that out. We'll have stuff in the show notes for it. Again, we couldn't possibly have covered everything on the PlayStation in one episode. So if there's stuff we missed, please shout it out. Let us know your favorite games, favorite peripherals, why you love the Pocket Station, why everyone should love the Pocket Station. But hit us with all of that stuff. We will definitely probably do follow-ups. And we love interacting with y'all in the Discord and other places. So hit us with some of your favorites from the PlayStation era.
Yes, let us know the series that we have forgotten. Why didn't we talk about Colony Wars at all? I'm going to say it here. Jammer Lammy is a better game than Parappa the Rapper. Come at me. Agree with me. Disagree with me. We want to know about all of those games that are out there because all of us learned about a new game just in this conversation right now. And I look forward to learning about new ones and discussing all of our memories together. So please reach out, get in touch with us. There's so many great ways to get in contact. We are Fun and Games Pod across all social media that we are active upon, which as of this episode is Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. We are funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk with on future episodes. Let us know your favorite 5-disc PS1 game. There's not many of them, but there is in fact more than one. There was over 20 games for the PS1 that had more than 2 discs. What is the most amount of discs you've ever had in a PS1 collection? It's an interesting question, and I'd want to know your take on it. You can visit certainpov.com and find not only so many other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations form, continue, and just play around. Bill often is on there showing off the latest acquisition that he's gotten, making us all drool, or whatever other discussions that we have. That is where, when I get new PS1 memory cards, new used PS1 memory cards, I show off some of the things that I find, especially if they're particularly odd, and I'd love to share that with all of you. If you want a one-stop shop of all the things that we work on, and if you have the inclination and means to financially support us, you can visit our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. There is a free tier, so you don't have to give any money to be a part of the community there. But when we do console retrospectives, we like to have our community vote on what console we do a retrospective upon. Being a member of the Patreon is how you can participate. We love and appreciate everybody that is a part of the community, and we want to shout out those up on the high scoreboard. And today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Nyden, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. There is about 5 seconds of loading time between each letter entered. Don't worry, the game hasn't frozen. If it's more than 15 seconds, then yes, the game is frozen, and unfortunately, you're going to have to reset. But don't worry, you're not going to lose your progress. We still appreciate you.
Also, by the time you're hearing this, there will be a new poll up for the next console retrospective. Please vote. Again, anyone who's just subscribed for free or higher can vote in those polls. I can't say what consoles will be in that poll because Geoff and I have yet to create it as of when we're recording. But by the time you hear this, that will be up, and please go vote. Also, if you have a moment, please rate us and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Also, then go rate and review all of Bill's podcasts as well, because that's how we really grow our audience. Patreon's great. We love having communities on Discord, but rating and review pushes us to the top of the list. So when folks search for PlayStation Retrospective on their podcast platform of choice, our highly rated podcast, episode, and show will jump to the top. It only takes a few minutes. And again, it's the best free way you can support the podcasts you love is by just rating and reviewing them. It doesn't take long at all. So please go and do that.
And whether you are rating, reviewing, whether you are a member of the Patreon, the Discord, or this is your first episode of Fun and Games, thank you so much for being here. We couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hello, my name is Aaron. I'm one half of SuperPod Saga, a topical variety video game podcast fueled entirely by nostalgia and unleaded gasoline. SuperPod Saga, we discuss a different video game topic each and every week. We have new episodes every single Monday covering a different video game topic. More than anything, we want to entertain our listeners and make you feel like you're one of the boys, like you're hanging out at a campfire with some of your best zany caffeine-powered buddies and just talking about your favorite games and all that stuff. Stop on down to SuperPod Saga. It's on every podcatcher there is. If it's not, let me know and we'll get on it. But again, SuperPod Saga, stop on by.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.